Okay, so let's start. Those who will join us later, we'll probably catch up with them and they could also review the recording. But thank you all for joining us today. We're going to cover interesting topics about active and passive listening coming together with AI. Briefly to introduce the speakers. So my name is Eitan, founder and CEO of Watercooler. Joining us today is Daniil from Canada. Daniil?
Yeah, so my name's Daniil. I'm an executive in residence at Mars, which is an innovation hub, and work with startups and have the pleasure of also advising Watercooler. So very cool space. Over to Sanya.
Hey everyone, it's so good to see some familiar names and some new ones. My name is Sanya Lucena. I'm the president of Question Pro Workforce, dialing in, as I mentioned, from beautiful Buenos Aires, Argentina. I'm an organizational psychologist by trade and have this incredible privilege of working for Question Pro, which is in addition to being an employee experience expert, especially when it comes to surveys and listening, is we also do customer experience and we're experts in market research. So as an organizational psychologist, I get to do a lot of uncovering of market trends, understanding what's going on in the labor market globally. Question Pro is a global organization. We're headquartered out of Austin, Texas, but we're still a work from anywhere shop. So we probably have almost as many countries as we have as employees, believe it or not. So more than likely, no matter where you're dialing in, we either have somebody in your country or nearby. So it's a really great pleasure to be here with you today and share the stage with Eitan and Daniil and tell you a little bit more around what's going on with AI, what's going on with active listening, passive listening, and so much more. As a quick housekeeping item, I did want to mention, please ask us questions in the chat throughout the webinar. The way webinars are set up, there's no audio, so it'll be hard for you to chime in verbally, but do throw in questions in the chat. And what we're going to do is we'll monitor those throughout the presentation, especially if there's a clarification question. If one of us is talking about something, you're like, oh, Sanya, I'm not actually clear what you're saying. Can you please clarify? Do let us know, because almost certainly you're not the only one who has that question, and we'll make sure to jump in and clarify anything that we need to make sure that the presentation resonates with you. If it's more of a discussion question, also feel free to ask it in real time. More than likely what will happen is we'll hold it for the end and open up for discussion and address any higher theoretical or practical questions. But anything that is a clarification, we will absolutely make sure to cover it during the presentation. And like I mentioned, other ones will be as they fit basis, but we'll definitely make sure to get to all of your questions.
Perfect. Thank you for that, Sanya. And I think we can start quickly to cover the agenda for today. As you could already understand, the topic in high level is the integrated approach for people analytics. Breaking it down, we'll start with why now? What's happening in the market that enables and allows the new approaches? What is AI anyhow? And just as more background about myself, I'm coming from about a decade in AI-related entrepreneurships. So we'll try to cover and dive just a bit deeper, skim the surface a bit around what's AI and how it works. Once we hopefully understand that better, where does it fit in? How does it affect our day-to-day? And by that time, when we have that covered, we'll dive into the convergence of surveys or passive listening with active listening. Active listening with passive listening. And Daniil will finish up with how do you take all that and put it into action at the very end. So starting with why now, and to cover that, starting with kind of the business perspective or trends even in the market. So starting last November, if I'm not mistaken, there are new regulatory recommendations to public companies to report on human capital related KPIs. Same with other commissions, especially in the US, that are requesting for annual reporting. And even though today is kind of a shrinkage period, when we look into the future, talent is going to be in a bigger and even bigger problem as time goes by. So we need to take better care of our people. That's the bottom line. That leads us to the next why. Yeah, need to address the mental health, the fatigue, DIB, remote and work from home challenges that we're all still facing. And eventually technology. You see ChatGPT all over, you see generative AI all over. There is, of course, new technology sweeping the market, and internal needs and requirements as we work with senior managers usually to have more data-driven and data-based evidence for decision-making, I would say. Interestingly, LinkedIn released this article, research earlier this year, about the 25 US roles that are growing in demand for 2023. Well, I didn't go through the entire list of 25, but number 2 was HR Analytics Manager. It clearly correlates with the market trends. Number 3, to strengthen that a bit, is Diversity and Inclusion Manager. And not far behind, number 5, Employee Experience Manager. So we see the trend, so to speak, coming to life in action. And this is just to try and set the stage about the rise, I would say, of people analytics in general, and also new approaches in more particular. Now, before continuing, or the next phase in the presentation today, is what is AI anyhow? I mean, we hear it all the time. Everybody uses it. Sometimes it's used over and over. I mean, more than what it needs to be used. And just a second before trying to explain that in layman terms, I would say that typically when a new technology comes to market, the normal reaction, or a very common one, is divided into one, fear of that technology. We don't understand it. We don't understand the implications. So a natural response would be fear. And on the other side, some people tend to very much glorify that new piece of technology, expecting that it will solve all of humanity's problems to some extent. So the goal today in the next few slides is to try and, I wouldn't say eliminate, but attenuate these natural responses. So to better understand how AI works, what it is, I want to start with how traditional software works. And that, quite straightforward. There's a set of input parameters, could be numbers, could be text, whatever. There is a piece of logic, what we call the program or rules, that are used to manipulate that input and to return some sort of output. So if we look as an example at the very complicated program, computer software that calculates house prices, the logic could be very trivial, right? 3 lines of code to that extent. Number of bedrooms times 50, square foot of living times 820, square foot of basement, simple calculation. So for every input that we choose, we get a certain output, and it's very, very repeatable. It will always be that output for that input. Quite simplistic, but this is how software works, set of rules. So if we put that aside for a second and dive deeper into AI and how that works, so we have the same, almost the same structure of input and output, yet the piece of logic, the set of rules, the codes that is manipulating the input is the unknown. The aim or the goal of an AI algorithm is to try and find what is that piece of logic, what are the set of rules, what are the patterns that should be used here. How does it do it? pretty much like humans. Not trying to scare you, it has tons of limitations, but it learns from available data. So if we continue with that example of the house prices, we start by looking at historical data. Let's take some examples to try and just understand what the logic is. So in that case, 20 or 15, it could be 2 million. And we also put the output. So we have an example of input parameters, historical output parameters. We feed it into the AI algorithms for them to detect the pattern. So now if we go to the same example we had before with the traditional piece of software, now that the patterns and the logic has been determined by the AI models, we can feed that input and get the output. Except this is a close approximation, because previously it was just a close but not identical price. And this is to say that AI has eventually some error margin that we always need to keep an eye on. Where is it becoming very powerful? That instead of 3 parameters, we feed it with 3,000, right? And instead of 20 examples, we feed it with 20 million examples. And this is where it becomes very powerful. This is where it helps humanity, helps us to find those hidden patterns that in many times were just undetectable to any human or traditional software trying to analyze it. This is in a nutshell. Of course, there are tons of more to say about it, many more complications, but I will leave it at this, and feel free to ask any questions, clarifying questions, and we'll do our best to address them. So now that we hopefully have an initial understanding about what AI is and how it works, let's see how it affects our day-to-day, right? Especially when we talk about our life at work. So McKinsey has recently published a very interesting article about the adoption of AI in the various business units. It's pretty much all over the place, and interestingly, human resources is just a bit lagging behind. Could be many reasons for that. One could be also the fear of new technology, or just the nature of the people. But if we look at how could it affect people analytics or HR, I'm going back to this example of the housing, tweaking it and simply changing the title to very much HR and people related metrics, right? So now if we have data sets that could be very large, hundreds and sometimes even thousands of different data points, we can feed them to the AI models, have them train on historical data, and then start asking questions. Where is the highest resignation risk? Where is the potential burnout risk? How are we diversified, et cetera, et cetera? And more importantly, not only ask the question, but also get a better understanding of what we can do about it. So with generative AI and ChatGPT out there already, the day is not very far where any HR manager could sit in a meeting with his laptop or her laptop and address every question that's coming from the peers or the managers or the board simply by asking in natural language the AI. So complex answers.
Sorry to interrupt you real quick, but Patrick had a question that maybe I wanted to just interject because I think maybe it's a good clarifying one. So he asked, is machine learning equal to AI in your opinion, or a subcategory of AI? I guess machine learning is not equal, for instance, to autonomous systems. So I just wanted, because I think it could be maybe a clarification as people are going through. So sorry to interrupt, but I just wanted to throw it in real quick.
So machine learning is a subset of AI. AI, I think, is the most holistic term. Under AI, there are various different types of machine learning approaches, neural nets, development approaches, GNN. So I don't want to go too deep into the technical discussions, but just to clarify, AI is kind of the top in the hierarchy. Under that, you find subsections of various different modeling techniques with different names. Good. With that, continuing to the third part of active and passive listening. So just some terminology, although I'm sure it's clear to most of us here. When we speak about active listening, it's mostly the surveys, being active and gathering information, gathering data, asking the people. And when we speak about the passive listening, it's more looking at the data trails a company, a business unit, a division, a team is generating, coming from the HR systems, coming from the various IT systems we work with, also known as behavioral analytics. Now, of course, each of them has its own advantages and limitations. And trying to quickly go over them, clearly, the advantages of the active listening would be that we allow our people to speak up. We're listening to what they have to say. In many ways, it captures the sentiment, not only yes and no questions or 1 to 5, but also open-ended questions. And it's here for decades as an industry standard already. On the other hand, some limitations, it's all self-reporting, subject to potential bias. Conducted periodically, it could become a lagging indicator where something require more frequent or quick time to respond. And partial response rate, not everybody is responding. There is a term that we're starting to hear about, survey fatigue. And now moving to the passive listening, advantages, it's IT data driven, right? IT data, very non-biased. It is continuously collected and in real time, and it covers the entire workforce. On the other hand, in some extent, it's pushing the human element aside, and of course, there are privacy concerns that has to be addressed. Looking at the data, I would even call it the dry data, many times we could miss the context. And it's a new emerging technologies in many ways. And if I try to focus for a second on the limitations, in what I'll do next, I'll swap the passive and active listening side just to see or depict what could happen when we combine the two. So passive listening has the limitation of pushing the human element aside, right? But if we combine that with active listening that allows the employees to speak up and puts the people in the center, then we can pretty much eliminate that first limitation. And if passive listening is missing the context and active listening is capturing the context, then we can also eliminate the second limitation, and so on and so forth. It pretty much, I wouldn't say eliminates all limitations, but eliminates some of the more important ones. So by combining the two, we pretty much get the both of both worlds. And at this stage, I'll stop for a second. Up until now, it was more the theoretical background. The next phase is where I hand it over to Sania to show some live examples. Tanya, handing it over to you.
Thank you so much. And I loved, I was reflecting as you were showing the slide and how much adoption there is in different groups of AI. And it was reflecting on my personal experience. And so I'm thinking, I'm constantly challenging myself, still a little bit more theory than in practice, I hate to admit, but how can AI improve my efficiency? And for those of you who know me, I love to be around people. I love to talk and learn from people and share my knowledge. From those of you who don't know me yet, they'll probably be clear by the time I'm done talking. But I committed myself to quite a few different talking engagements and all very unique ones in May. And I was losing it trying to prepare content for all of it. I just thought, and so I work for a technology company, and one of my colleagues said, Batsanya, why don't you use ChatGPT? And I thought, oh, okay, I'll play around with it. And I was trying to find some different hiring trends from blue collar work. A lot of the work that I do is, with knowledge workers and people at the computer. So I thought, well, if I'm going to give this presentation, I have to be an expert. I have to really study this area. And so I went into ChatGPT and asked it a few questions. And I thought, but where are all the citations? Where are all the research studies this is coming from? Who said this? And so what I found is that it actually gave me some really good ideas to think about and further research. But I found myself that I'm not fully comfortable claiming this is true unless I have data behind it, unless I know who said it. But it gave me really good ideas to start. So I think I will not generalize my personal experience to all of you, but I've worked with an HR for a little bit over 20 years. I've stopped counting. And I know that the conservative part of me and the part that thinks like some of these things are not necessarily second nature to me, some of these things I need to be really sure about. But everything that we're hearing today is that as much as possible, we need to experiment and get comfortable with different ways of using AI, not without any conscious thought, not without evaluation, not with, like I was saying, I saw some findings in it and I thought, well, but I want to double check. I won't just use it without any questioning. But it is just really fascinating. Actually, we're just recently talking to a gentleman who was on our podcast, and he had mentioned using AI to create your family weekly menu. So again, I don't know out of you how many you plan your family meals. I have to do it because I'll tell you, I have a 4.5-year-old, and by the time I'm done with my daily meetings and I go downstairs, last night I just thought, what am I going to make for dinner? And I made a list on Sunday. And so I didn't actually have to give it thought. But it also helps give you new ideas. So you're not doing the same thing time and time again. So anyways, just a little bit of anecdotes before I go into my actual business scenario that I'll share with you. I promise that wasn't the real life case, but I was just thinking about, again, reflecting on that smaller percentage of probably a lot of us who are in this group and our propensity to use AI, and just wanted to give you a couple of foods for thought for one and how it's worked for me in some other contexts to start to adopt it. So I have loved working with Eitan and his team, combining active and passive data. Because for me, when I was getting my PhD many moons ago, surveys were the only way to really collect information. Behavioral data was not a thing there. And as somebody that's very spend a lot of a lot of my time researching relationships at work and understanding how to connect with people, having that information, being able to ask people and having that conversation is so incredibly critical. But I also love the rise of different behavioral data. And as you can tell, I give a lot of personal anecdotes, but, different biomarkers. And for me, I don't have a wearable yet. I literally have nothing. I took off the bracelets that my kids made me earlier, but I was looking into an Oura ring and saying, I'd love to see how much more I sleep. I'd love to see what I can do better, because technology is allowing us to do that. So I joke around that my husband has a smartwatch and he knows how much he's sleeping, sometimes for better or worse, but he knows, and he knows his steps and everything like that. But I always say that never substitutes us having a conversation at dinner and me asking him, how are you? And how do you feel? And how was your day? Yeah. And I could say hey, how many hours did you sleep? Or check his wearables. But that gives me some information, but it's not a substitute for that conversation. but it's a great addition. And so how does this come together in what we do? How does it come together in employee experience? So if we look at the next slide, as we were preparing for today, Eitan and I thought about, what are the specific steps and how can organizations think about this? And in all the conversations that I've had and what Eitan shared before, surveys have become, they're more of an institutional thing. It's something that for many of us, if we do something in our organization, more than likely we're asking, we're sending surveys, we're asking questions. And I actually was really pleasantly surprised. I was just a couple of weeks ago at an event called Telreos in Chicago, and it was some of the brightest minds in talent analytics. And I felt so fortunate to be there because with the lack of in-person events for a while, I really missed out on those conversations and the real life presentations as well. And what really pleasantly surprised me is how many organizations were still talking about surveys that they do, and the great insights that they get and the actions that they've gleaned from it. So when we thought about this model and when we thought about how does, behavioral data, how does active and passive listening fit in, really, this is the way that we've envisioned it. So annual surveys, I put stepping in. Originally, I put don't do it. And the reason I had don't do it is because if you look at the basic, there's annual surveys and light action. And so Eitan mentioned survey fatigue. And we know from a lot of the research that we've done and talked to our employees, it's not that I'm so incredibly tired from taking, 5 or 10 minutes to fill out your survey. I'm so incredibly tired of filling out your survey and you're not doing anything about it. I don't want to do it anymore. I want my 5 or 10 minutes back. And so the one thing that we wouldn't necessarily recommend is just doing an annual survey and not doing anything about it. But maybe that's just that stepping in. At least you're informed, even if you don't take an action immediately. You understand better that's what's going on in your culture, and knowing is better than not knowing. Some of the basic approach is doing the annual survey and taking some light action. So maybe you're not doing something that's necessarily going to transform your organization, but you are sharing those findings with your employees and you are actually actioning the data. And I call this advanced because, again, we'll publish this data soon still, but I can't help but talk about it. We recently surveyed about a little bit over 1,000 workers in the US, full-time workers who work for organizations, 1,000 employees and over. And about half of them said that they weren't surveyed at all in the last year. And that took my breath away because for that size organization, I thought, well, the vast majority of organizations must be surveying at that size. And we found that that's not the case. So being able to do these annual surveys, running actual initiatives, and then pulsing to measure how effective are your initiatives, even today in 2023, is actually, based on what we're seeing in market research, a quite advanced strategy. But what we're talking about today are really these leading strategies. So how do you listen to your employees? And how do you see what's actually happening to combine and really understand them? It's like the what and the why, to figure out your how. So in looking at that, we'll go through an example of how would you run an annual survey, look at some behavioral data to really understand and have a deeper dive around certain sentiments of your employees. How do you really run strategic initiatives around that and involve your workforce? And then how do you turn on always on surveys and look at behavioral data to really in real time monitor the impact of those initiatives? And maybe you don't, look at your findings like week one and say, no, the initiative's not working, or like, oh, it's a slam dunk, this is amazing, because we all know there's a honeymoon period usually when we launch something. But having that always on listening strategy really helps us see, do we need to tweak something? Are there other events happening inside our organization that are impacting those initiatives, et cetera? So if we look at the first set of data on the next slide, it will be the intro slide. So we're going to walk you through hypothetical data around the specific well-being initiative. So we're starting with an annual survey, right? Because I would bet without having talked to you. So my hypothesis as a researcher would be that a lot of you who are on this call are doing annual surveys and you are taking some action, but you're thinking about what's next. Like, I want to make a bigger impact. How can I understand more about our employees? How can I maybe introduce additional AI into what I'm doing? So we'll start with something that's likely familiar for you. So again, most of the organizations that we talk with, even if they're doing pulse surveys, even if they're doing some kind of always on listening, they have some kind of a flagship survey. Usually it happens at the beginning of the year, and it's in a way this reset moment to say, last year we asked our employees how they feel, we ran certain initiatives, now we want to understand what's going on. And what we see is that oftentimes priorities do shift. So oftentimes what happens with organizations is something that was maybe the greatest challenge, you invested time and energy in, and it worked, and now maybe it flipped, and it's not as big of a pain point anymore, but something else is. And so that's why we're still advocates of having these specific pillars that you measure, doing that diagnostic that helps you set the tone for the rest of the year. It doesn't mean that you don't check in. It doesn't mean that you don't reevaluate. But realistically, again, one of the biggest challenges I hear across the board isn't taking action. So it's not like realistically we can do 12 huge surveys. Maybe some of you can, depending on the size of your team. The most organizations can do something really big every month and make these big changes. So they start with one milestone survey that sets the tone for the rest of the year. So for example, in this sample, we can find that one of the key challenges is well-being. And we can see what are some of the factors so that had the lowest scores. So my health and well-being matter to my manager, not so good. I'm satisfied with my overall well-being. That's generally like the high level metric that we measure against. My levels of work-related stress are manageable. Why could that be? Oh, I can shut off from work and find time to rest. Not doing so great on that. And so you start to see some of these indicators for well-being and think about, well, how do I dig into this more? And oftentimes, especially for any larger size organizations, you have to start to peel back and see, well, what's happening in different areas. And so for example, like we saw on the next slide, if you look and say, are there particular pain points? If you looked at this data before, you know there always are. You know that there is really no chance or very little chance that the findings are uniform across departments, that the findings are uniform against different geographies. Oftentimes what happens is there's different expectations, there's different stress levels based on roles. You might have different leaders, and depending on how much those leaders in particular are paying attention to employee experience and to the culture, that will very much resonate within the data. So even in the survey data, of course, you can start to peel back the onion and see where these particular pain points and where do I invest most of my time making these kinds of improvements. Now, what happens a lot of times, at least in my experience, is that we want to know more. We want to know more. And some of the ways that, we can do that is follow-up survey. It's a focus group. It could be some one-on-one. So for instance, in this case, sales is bleeding red. We have to have conversations. We can take some of the leaders, we can take, a random sample of volunteers or different individuals and say, listen, I really don't know how you answer this survey, but we know that your team is having some particular challenges in well-being, and we'd love to follow up with you, on some more information. So there is that high human touch to understand more on a more intimate level what's going on. But unlike AI, it's really hard to scale. So you can only have so many of those one-on-ones and anecdotes, above and beyond the numerical responses to the survey and the open-endeds. So then if we look at the next slide, that's really where this behavioral data comes in. And so to me, in my experience, this has been such a phenomenal complement to start to understand not just from the sentiment in the employees, but what's going on. And so again, this is just sample data, but you can take a look and see, well, for example, for working hours a day, sales and marketing are two of the teams that have the highest working times. Account management does as well, but it doesn't seem to be as big of a pain point in their sentiment. They don't seem to be as bothered at the time with it, but these two groups are. And then looking at things like extreme hours. So in the world, when we're figuring out hybrid workplaces, we're figuring out flexible workplaces, I will tell you the vast majority of companies are still not sure what to do. A lot of them are making the decisions on, do we go back to the office? How do we go back to the office? There's some phenomenal organizational network analysis that's been done. And if you're not familiar with Michael Arena's work, I would highly recommend for you to check it out. I saw his presentation at the Transform conference that I attended in March, and he shared some very fascinating data on when being in person helps productivity, what kind of business cycle you might be in. Are you innovating? Are you maintaining? And what kind of additional advantage being together gives you if you're in person versus if you're remote. And I found that fascinating because from my work, I'm a huge proponent of finding ways for us to really get the best out of our careers, the best out of our family lives, the best out of our complete personal lives. And I'll tell you, I don't have the answers for how to do that. But I also tell you that I'm completely terrified in some of the trends that I'm seeing that we might be going to before pre-pandemic era. And we're just saying, everybody back in the office, we're done. The pandemic's done. We can do this. I think a lot of organizations will remember the benefits we had in different working styles. But this is the kind of data that if you are the CEO or COO, or if you're working with your CEO and COO, and you feel like they're about to make some decisions without necessarily asking employees, without necessarily looking at data, these are the kinds of stories that you can tell. And we'll show you some outcome data as well, but this is that behavior. Like, why are we messaging people, and why are people working before 8 a.m. and after 6 p.m. at such high rates? Is there a way, is this an absolute necessity? Or is this something that we can adjust? But you see those numbers. So it's not saying, oh, people are just being whiny. Like, what do you mean they have to work that much? No, we're actually logging that. And this one breaks my heart a little bit too, interrupted vacation days. So I've had many conversations around the philosophy of that. And there are individuals that will say, you know what, I go on vacation, but I need to check in. I need to understand what's going on with my team. And if I don't, I'm going to be more anxious and I'm not going to enjoy my vacation. There are people that say, you know what, I'll keep an eye on different things, but I'm not necessarily going to respond. And I'll tell you, I'm one of those. I'm kind of in the middle where I want to know if my team really needs me. I'll be there for them. But I also don't want to set the expectation that when they go on vacation, they're checking as well. And then there are the people that are like, you know what, I'm gone for 2 weeks or 1 week or whatever it is, pretend like I don't exist. All of you should know how to like drive this ship without me. And if you don't, we got some bigger problems than me being on vacation for 1 week. So I think in that case, this information is really powerful because one, in the surveys, one of the biggest things we're seeing is that people feel like they can't unplug, they can't find time to rest. And so when we're thinking about how do I action that? What does that really mean? What do they need? You can look at this kind of data and say, stop messaging people when they're on vacation. If your team is not self-sufficient, that they can survive 1 week without a specific team member, you need to readjust that. Because guess what? That team member could leave in 2 weeks. That team member could take a job somewhere else. So for us to be able to give people grace and time that they need is really critical. And again, using this kind of data shows you that in behavior, and it'll show you as you take actions in real time, like how effective is this and how is it relating to my people's level of stress? Because it's very different if you say somebody is working extreme hours, but it's their preference. Like, I don't feel stressed out, it's my style, but that's not what the surveys data is telling you. So from the storytelling standpoint, I always think about, I love data and I can spend hours with it. Like, I mean, you need to pull me away. More often than not, when we're in front of decision makers, when we're in front of our CEOs, we have 10, 15 minutes to tell a really compelling story and get the resources and the budget that we need. The reason why I love this data and how it works together is I've seen that it really effectively tells the story to somebody who doesn't think about this information all day, every day, doesn't want to look at really complex numbers and try to figure out these really difficult models, but is the person that can make that decision. If we jump to the next slide, I'll reel myself back. I could talk about, I could
Maybe
stand
just
this.
one comment from my side, Sonia,
Yes,
interjecting for a
absolutely.
second. Interestingly, in a recent working with a recent customer, about 1,200 employees based out of New York, we found out with the water cooler solution that one of their top contributor or indicator or predictor for resignation was complete lack of engagement over weekend and PTOs. So on the one hand, you have those like the SAIDs here that are working 50% of the time while they're off. But on the other hand, and it also aligns with the research recently published by Illinois University, that a certain degree of activity beyond working hours over weekends shows that level of engagement. If it's completely zeroed out, this is where potentially, and again, it's a particular case of a certain company, resignation risk increases.
Yeah. Yeah. I
Quick
love that
question
example.
from Alyssa. Sorry, quick question from Alyssa, asking about specifically the vacation day graphs. What are the sources that pull these metrics? Is it your HRS? What's the sources?
Yeah, so I will take that one. It's a combination. It's actually fusion from multiple data sources, starting with the HRIS to see where the vacation days registered. And then the level of activity could be Slack or email or calendar or Jira or CRM or a bunch of different others IT systems that we often use on a day-to-day and an hourly, if not minute basis. So it's a combination of multiple sources.
Love that. And I was just going to say, I love your example with different work styles. Like one of the things that I like researching is even different people's life stages and how you approach work. And so when I was younger and first entering the workforce, I was single. I loved my job. I've always loved my job. Like whether I'm working 8 to 10 hours a day or 12 hours a day, it's just how I distribute my time. And I remember oftentimes I would work later at night. I would work on the weekends, and never because I felt like I had to, because I loved to, and I could. I wasn't borrowing that time. I was still going out with friends and having a good time. So it wasn't coming at a cost of anything. Now I have a small child at home. And yesterday, my CEO and COO, we wanted to follow up on an employee survey we're doing internally. And I'm in Argentina on 1 hour ahead of Eastern time, and they're in Pacific time. Pretty big difference. And so they asked me, hey, we're available today. Are you free? And I said, well, it's 7 o'clock my time. My husband's traveling. So if you want to, bring my 4-year-old Mateo, I can do it. But otherwise, it's not an ideal time. And they said, no, don't worry. We'll do it the next day. In a different stage of my life, I would have just said yes, because maybe I wouldn't have had plans, and it doesn't matter. And so I think that's the difference in the sentiment and asking people how they're feeling and looking at their behavior. Because today I will still work if I need to, but I've on the weekends at night. But what I've done now is I built this incredible team that allows me not to have to do that. Because today, probably if I was working nights and weekends, I would be more stressed out, because it would be coming at a cost of my not spending time with my family. And again, being a psychologist, I read enough about, what are you going to regret on your deathbed, and like, or these things. And I'm like, spend time with my family. I absolutely do. But anyways, I love that, the interpretation and what kinds of behaviors lead to different things, and the fact that there's a lot of individualization that we can see from this data. So then jumping to our next slide, this is just some of the drivers. So some of the things that going along the looking at survey data, looking at behavioral data, how is it impacting outcomes? This is just a simple illustration of a correlation. But it's important to know there are certain factors, the importance and performance of an organization. So how much, does my well-being matter to my manager? We can see that actually that has a much higher correlation to something like an ENPS score than something like, I feel like I can achieve, my goals and objectives with a balance. One is that human relationship. And do I feel seen? Do I feel heard? Do I matter? Another one is a little bit more of the time management. So I would definitely encourage you, as you're going through your data, as you're doing the analysis, to always look at the outcomes, because it's not just because you're scoring on something lower, maybe in a survey or maybe your employees are working longer hours, that doesn't necessarily mean that those are always going to have the greatest relationship to your outcomes. So as all of us are really picking and choosing, trying to be as smart as possible about it, as strategic as possible, what are different initiatives, those outcome variables are really important to take a look at. So then jumping to the next slide, this again, I mentioned before, and I'll probably keep mentioning it for a while now until we figure it out, is that for most organizations too, taking action on the data is one of the biggest pain points. And it's the idea of, some things are maybe more easily fixed, more easily tracked, like our managers checking in with their employees. You can have a technology for that. You can track how often people are checking in. What is the quality of that interaction? Could be maybe something a little more complex, but maybe again, something, medium that's trackable. One of the things that, for example, that we found in our benchmarking study that we just ran and in the Question Pro survey of our employees is a big area on career development and how satisfied people are with where they are today. And so that's having us reflect on all different kinds of things, like, do we need to add additional levels between people? But that's not necessarily our philosophy. How do we develop different skill sets? What could be our differentiator? What kind of opportunities can we give to people inside of our organization that, because of our geographic setup, because of the nature of our business, maybe we can offer more easily than some other organizations can? The same thing with well-being. Well-being is very different for different individuals. And so it can be a lot of emotional, it can be a lot of physical, it can be a lot of different stress factors depending on your visibility to your team. One of the strongest recommendations that I can make is to try to make this as collaborative as possible. So one of the biggest takeaways that I'm getting from, the conferences I'm going to is that a collaborative process is becoming a lot more prevalent in organizations. And it's going from anywhere to choosing what kind of technology system to invest in, all the way down to different initiatives. So what I would recommend, again, is as you're getting all of this kind of data, as you feel like you're getting a lot clearer picture, continue to involve your employees in executing the initiative, but also involve them for ideas. So that's something that maybe you won't necessarily easily get from an annual survey from the behavioral data, but you can ask them, listen, we hear that you feel like you can't unplug. We feel like, you feel like you can't really take the time to recharge. Here are some 3 or 4 ideas that we have for what we would like to do. Can you please vote on them? Thumbs up if you like it. And can you maybe give us some more ideas? Because there could be some very simple things that people would recommend that maybe, 5, 10 of us that are sitting and looking at the data in very much detail, maybe we haven't thought about them. Maybe not all of us represent the diverse population that works for our organization and the different kinds of needs that they have. So this very much also improves involvement, improves engagement, and we found some really positive results from the employee input on the kinds of actions that organizations could take. So that would be one area, again, that I would highly recommend. And it's a lot more scalable than, the one-on-ones. I wouldn't say it necessarily replaces maybe the individual conversations, but you can certainly get a lot more input at a faster rate and a lot more ideas than scheduling one-on-one calls. So jumping to the next slide, this is a little bit around, follow-up and having these always on surveys. And in one of my last presentations, somebody asked me about surveys that you just put in and somebody can go in and answer, right? So it's a link, it's always live. It's almost like maybe a digital suggestion box. And my general experience with it so far is that I've not necessarily seen it work. Why? Because people forget about it. You might launch it, you'll get some ideas again, first week, second week, and then it tapers off. One of the things that we've really seen is it has to still be a push. And maybe that'll change sometime in the future. But based on the varied experience that we've seen today, there has to be some kind of a reminder. And always on could mean different things for your organization. If you're a larger organization, it could be random sampling of different departments, so not everybody is hearing from you weekly. It could be a part of your communication. So if there is some kind of a weekly recap that you do, if there is a town hall, just a reminder for people that, hey, we're listening to you. You can give your opinions here. You can change up the questions if you want. That's really important. And the reason why it's really valuable is that it helps you get this information on an ongoing basis. So if there's a specific company event that happens, you already have this mechanism in place, and you can see, we just changed our CEO, or we just introduced a new head of HR, or somebody, we just split the marketing team in two and now they're reporting to somebody else. Because you have this mechanism in place, you can get that sentiment at the same time that announcement's being made, and you can see the differences in behavior. So it becomes this very powerful, real-time, event-based kind of insight. And so when it comes to different kinds of AI, you can also think about, as you continue to enhance and advance the kinds of questions that you're asking, AI can actually help with different question generation. It can give you different ideas. And maybe you're, in this route of like, we've been asking these several, similar surveys for several years. If I want to know about well-being, what kind of questions could I ask? And that's something, for example, that we've incorporated into Question Pro, that as you're creating your surveys, as you're analyzing your data in that actual technology, you can get that kind of inspiration as well. And then I think we're on my final slide, so we can wrap up and see if there are any additional questions. This is what I was mentioning with tracking. So those always on surveys and behavioral data, when you have it in place, I mentioned a lot of times it's not, you're not going to necessarily like launch an initiative and it's going to have this huge impact. You might launch an initiative and, it starts to go a little bit and then people forget about it. I've had this. One of the examples I showed was yoga and mindfulness. And that's something that we personally did at Question Pro. And the first session, a third of the company showed up. I couldn't believe it. I thought, I didn't know we had so many yogis here. Like, how brilliant is this? And then we realized that it weaned a little bit over time, but then we had some regulars and we tweaked and we played around with, days of the week and how long the sessions are and how do we find a time that everybody globally can join. And then you can have different initiatives that can actually really have that spike. And so here is an example of, hey, we just launched something that's really impactful. Let's continue to monitor over time. See, is it, the honeymoon period? Is it going to drop a little but still sustain? Is it something that people are going to love and then maybe not engage in anymore? So again, being able to look at that kind of sentiment data and what kind of scores are we getting, for example, in a well-being measure, but then how is that playing out with our behavioral data? Are we actually seeing a drop in working hours between these different teams? Is that's what's driving it? Is there something else going on? So this is just, again, an example of that life cycle and how you might be able to take survey data and incorporate some of the behavioral data. And then Eitan, I think this is the real life example of a client.
Yeah, I would say that
sharing her reaction.
Yeah, let me just make sure that I'm sharing with sound. Yeah, that should be fine. Oh, looks like I cannot share with sound. Some kind of technical glitch here. Maybe Gia, you can help us with that. Okay, so I'm not sure. Yeah, it could be a permission issue. If we can resolve it in a few seconds, then I guess we'll just continue. Trying again. For some reason, I cannot share with the sound active. So basically, just telling you briefly, when we presented these results, which are all behavioral analytics to a certain customer, the immediate response on her side was to correlate that very even unintentionally with their engagement surveys. So seeing a certain sales team here working extreme hours, working overtime, working while on vacation, really correlated to what she was seeing in the recent survey, and helping her explain a lot of the phenomena in that surveys. And another example that, again, unfortunately for technical reasons, I cannot play the sound here. One of the KPIs that with behavioral analytics we're able to generate is the inefficient meeting ratio. So here you see customer success team where 30% of their meetings are with more than 8 participants, usually with the manager of the team taking part. And the customers seeing that immediately correlated that with exit interviews in that case, where people are saying that they don't feel trusted in that particular team. So these are some of the examples. Oh. And with that, we will conclude by handing it over to Daniil to cover the last slide with how or what should be taken care of when we want to initiate and roll out such solutions. So Daniil, handing it over to you now.
Okay, so we're down to 3 minutes. So I'll probably skip through some of my stuff, but we know that really what I wanted to share was 5 tips on acting on insights, right? Like that's basically what we want to do with the data. We want to implement it. We want to get some results. And that's really what our employees, when Sonia talked about survey fatigue, it's because they don't see the results. They don't get that, oh, this is why I did this. I'm motivated to do this again. So I think, you know, before you act on those insights, getting everyone engaged, whether it's employees who need to know, you know, why are we doing this? Why are we collecting this data? How am I going to benefit from it? To the leadership team who, you know, really ties the data to the objectives, creates that urgency to do the work, to implement the solutions, to the frontline managers who are the ones who, work with their team to implement it. So they want to feel like the survey isn't done to them, it's with them, and they can be curious about it. They can say, yeah, I wonder about that data. I wonder if our meeting culture is adding to the burnout. So just involving and getting all of these stakeholders really committed and understanding, and then even the ability to, once you get the data, analyze the data and validate the data and ask questions about the data is really, really important. So finally, you have the insights. What we typically do is we all get in our teams and we say, okay, teams, let's figure this out. I think for me, fundamentally, what's wrong with that is that most of these problems, whether it's burnout or sense of belonging, these are systematic issues. These are issues we all care about in the organization. So a framework that I think I've seen work better is to say, hey, here are the 2 or 3 problems we've solved. We want to form cross-functional groups, people who are really interested in solving these problems in our organization, and get just diverse representative teams across the organization to solve your 2 or 3 problems. And I like what Sonia said, once you have some of the solutions, then you can get the rest of the employees to upvote them and, get really the best ideas. And then with those teams, you can have an executive member on those teams so that they can make decisions. You can have a great facilitator so they can ideate. And basically, you have 2 or 3 manageable solutions that go forward. You implement in that next town hall. You come and you update everyone on the progress. So you actually know like what you did mattered, it counts. And then I think my last thing to just say is, if you've collected that passive and active data, collect it again to see what has changed. Right? So those are sort of my 5 tips in 1 minute that I wanted to share. And back to you, Sonia, for the call to action.
I love it. Thank you so much. I think those are such important points. So we just wanted to wrap up with one more thing. So if you enjoyed what you heard today, if you think it would be valuable for your organization, we are offering just 5 personalized workshops. So we can't do a ton, but what we'd love to do is, contact us. We'll share our contact information on the next slide. Let us know a little bit about your organization. We'll jump on a call with you. The idea is if you want to pull in a few stakeholders, and it's up to you who that is, and really have like a practical workshop around this is the kind of data that we have. Maybe, we don't use behavioral data yet, or we don't use surveys or behavioral data, or we'd love to do it together. Whatever if you were inspired by something today and you would like us to jump on a call with you in a small group of your colleagues of your choosing to figure out a practical way to implement this in your organization or figure out any next steps, let us know. And again, we can have an initial call to understand what your need is better and, define what that is. But we feel so passionately about what we're doing. We do think that this kind of information is so powerful together and that it can really help organizations make a huge difference. So if we jump to the next slide, this is where you can grab, and we'll share this with you afterwards. But this is our contact information. So you can either reach out to me or Eitan at Water Cooler, and either one of us will organize together. So both are good. But again, it helps us to understand more and more what organizations' real scenarios are. Oftentimes we work with companies that already have buy-in for this and, have budget and have implemented it. If you feel like you're at the phase that you would love to do it, but you need to understand better how it would impact your organization, how to make a case for it. Again, we'd love to talk with you. So thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, Danielle. Thank you, Eitan. It was just lovely to share this time with you. Thank you all for joining us today. We hope we found we hope you found this valuable. We will follow up with a recording and a recap email in the slides. And then again, anytime you want to reach out to us or find us on LinkedIn, we didn't put our handles, but you can find us relatively easily on there. Please do so. We'd love to continue a conversation.
Good. Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks so much, everybody. Again, take care and see you soon.